The Belmont Report. Respect for persons. Participants receive informed consent. No misleading or coercing. Protects autonomy and vulnerable individuals. 2. Principle of beneficence. Weigh risks and benefits of experiment. Protect participants from harm. 3. Principle of justice. Balance between treating people fairly in the experiment. Every participant has access to benefits. Tuskegee experiments. The Tuskegee experiments were conducted in the late 1920s and early 1930s on African American men who were infected with syphilis. The experiment was deemed necessary because the disease was considered untreatable and limited infected individuals from working and contributing to society in a time of poverty and hardship. The Tuskegee Institute studied 400 already infected men, and 200 who were not yet infected. These treatments involved the infusion of toxic metals which resulted in harmful and even fatal side effects. Men only agreed to participate in the study as it gave them access to health care that they has never had access to. From start to finish, this experiment never involved beneficial treatments, and only harmed those who were involved. Respect for persons Tuskegee study. The Tuskegee experiments violated the principle of respect for persons as every man recruited for the experiment was deceived in terms of the validity and benefits of the treatments. The text states that men were recruited in their community churches and schools, and that they were all enthusiastic about participating as the project would give them access to medical care for the first time in their lives. Little did they know that the health care they were receiving was in no way curing their disease, and in many cases, worsening their symptoms and causing harmful and even fatal side effects. Researchers would in fact lie to the patients, telling them it was a special free treatment for their illness. Principle of beneficence Tuskegee study. The Tuskegee syphilis study involved 600 men. 400 of them had syphilis. These men were misled into believing that the experiment would be beneficial to them and that they'd receive beneficial health care. However, the researchers withheld information and misled them. The study was to observe the long-term effects of untreated syphilis. The men were harmed through invasive medical tests and refused treatment of their syphilis. Because benefits were withheld from the participants with syphilis and they were misled about the purpose of the study, the participants were harmed. The benefits of the study, understanding the long-term effects of syphilis, did not outweigh the risks and harm that participants faced. Principle of justice Tuskegee study. The Tuskegee experiments went against the principles of justice as patients were deceived from the moment they agreed to participate in the experiment. Justices calls for the patients of the experiment to be treated fairly, and be informed of the details of the treatments, and neither condition was respected in this situation. The researchers conducting the experiment were not treating participants fairly in that they knowingly lied to patients, and gave them harsh, unbeneficial treatments. Additionally, they purposefully hid the details of their treatment to keep people involved in the case for their personal scientific benefit. Pit of despair. The Pit of Despair experiments were conducted by Harry Harlow in the 1960s–1970s. In this experiment, Harlow worked to find a solution to depression by experimenting with monkeys. Harlow set up his experiment by putting socialized and bonded monkeys in an enclosed space alone with a view of the outside, to see if they developed the symptoms of depression. Respect for persons Pit of Despair. Although the patients involved in this experiment were not human, this experiment still violates the respect for persons principle as monkeys are living beings. Obviously, Harlow was unable to communicate with animals, so he violated that concept by testing on the monkeys without their consent. The monkeys were vulnerable to being used disrespectfully, which goes against the principle of respect. Principle of beneficence Pit of Despair. Harlow's Pit of Despair study violated the principle of beneficence. The benefit of the study was understanding maternal bonding, but he did this at the cost of putting monkeys into severe isolation. The monkeys suffered emotional stress and began to show symptoms of depression within a few days. Even though the participants were monkeys, They were harmed in the study and experienced emotional stress and trauma. There are other ways that Harlow could have studied the effects of maternal bonding without treating monkeys in a maleficent way. Principle of justice, pit of despair. Harlow's experiment goes against the principle of justice, as the monkeys were obviously mistreated throughout the experiment, but also were disregarded after the study was complete. For this experiment to be slightly more ethical, Harlow should have obviously given more respect to the monkeys in the experiment, but also worked to treat the monkeys' mental discomfort after being tortured in the study.